So we're gonna talk a little bit about the question of shifting experience and in mixed reality contexts. And I'm going to start off with describing an artistic situation to invoke the uncanny. So I'm going to I enter into a gallery and stand before a flat panel screen in portrait format with a small camera attached on the side. The image on the screen is that of a body standing in A pose. Of course, everybody knows the term originating from computer animation that describes a natural stance with arms angled downward at about 45 degrees, forming an A shape with the body. As I
Sorry,
position myself into this pose,
sorry, Chris, we're
which
not
is,
seeing the next slide. Could you just see if you progress to the next slide? We're still on your title screen.
yeah, it's fun. That's correct.
Okay.
As I position myself into this pose, which is reflected in the whiteout figure standing before me on the screen, a sudden flash takes place and the figure vanishes. I'm then greeted with the phrase, "The system is processing you. Please take a headset." The attendant to this strange ritual provides me with a bulky and almost wraparound headset, a pair of VR glasses that are strapped uncomfortably to my face. I'm greeted by what sounds like elevator music, annoying muzak that is occasionally interrupted with a disembodied voice stating, "Please hold the line." I'm told the experience will begin. There's a sharp blast of white noise, and suddenly I'm confronted with my self-image standing before a mirror in the real space. Of course, I recognize that this apparition, a kind of double or doppelganger, which seems to have been generated from the capture of my body with the camera, is fake. The image both appears to be a realistic rendering of me, but at the very same moment is riddled with errors and mistakes. There's a strange hole inside of my arm. The grinning face which stares into the mirror is frozen as if in suspended animation. The feet seem to be a reflection of my feet, but are distorted and twisted. Suddenly, the mirror begins to crack, accompanied by breaking noises. The white noise blast comes again, and the screen goes blank. Okay, so this is, of course, not my image, but it's somebody else that built the piece. But what is going on here? I've used this short and incomplete discussion of an artistic project, which is actually named Doppelganger Apparatus, not to discuss psychoanalytic understandings of the self, but instead to provoke a different question, which is very much the context in the conference, which is what kind of experience of presence, i.e., the belief of being there, and immersion, the ability of the technology to enable such a belief, takes place in this strange context. That is the context of wearing a VR headset, in this case, a MetaQuest 3, that attempts to create not a virtual experience, but rather a combination of real and constructed. Such mixed reality, of course, the term coined by computer scientists Paul Milgram and Fumio Kishino in 1994, describes having both virtual space on the one hand and reality on the other, available within the same environment. Of course, as a visual display environment, it could also be acoustic as well as other sensory modalities. Yet, since Milgram and Kishino proposed the concept of mixed reality together with the technological development of HMDs through Microsoft's HoloLens in the 1990s and then the Magic Leap in the 2000s, the concept of presence as telepresence, as action at a distance, may be shifting by way of the emergence of a new technological paradigm. That is, of course, video pass-through. The pass-through, of course, is a process which involves capturing video from external cameras, mounted, of course, on the device, and displaying this video image directly on the screen or an HMD in real time. In other words, the idea is to pass through the outside world into the display, allowing the user to see both their physical environment as well as computationally generated one that appears to be embedded in the real environment while wearing the device. So the argument I want to pose here is that such pass-through technologies, a technology which seems utterly strange and artificial, could suggest a different experience of presence. Now, I use the term experience, and then we'll talk about maybe later about notions of measurement, and its associated term immersion. And this might shift us from the standard notion of suspension of disbelief, which girds a lot of thinking around, of course, extended reality, to that of artifice. That is, believing that what one experiences from the perspective of the HMD mixing up the real and the computation is not believable, that is, not real, but a technically enabled construction which has little verisimilitude to the real world. For example, as in the case of this doppelganger experiment. In other words, what would it signify to think of presence and immersion within such a technological instrumentarium as the pass-through HMD, not as engulfing the user participant's attention in a constructed world, which pretends to be believable, but instead forms a condition that Benjamin called shock, the manner in which modern technologies serve to rupture, dislocate, and alienate our received perception of the world. Now, I'm going to talk about three kind of contexts. The first is a project called Probing XR's Futures that kind of frames this. The second is very briefly presence and immersion in the context of theories of coextensive space. And the last is theater and performance studies, the area actually I originally come from, critiques of presence. So the first is that these questions that I'm posing stem from an ongoing project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation called Probing XR's Futures, which is a 4-year project that asks 3 specific questions. One is, how does extended reality reshape bodily subjectivity, interaction and experience and situated action? The second is, how can disabled bodies reshape XR's extremely normative vision of presence, bodies, and experience? And third, how could bodily experience, both singular and plural, be brought to bear on critical inquiry to probe extended reality's futures in the current context, in the present? And there's 3 aspects of this project. The first is thinking about the kind of genealogies of the head-mounted display that, of course, started in the mid-1960s, and that create different forms of attention within kind of mixed reality situations. Another thread of this project is looking at using design fiction to kind of model certain, interaction scenarios of what might be in the future. And the third is to explore XR in the wild, that is, in interactions within, say, the open public space. Now, let's go back. And the other thing I would quickly say is that all of this is based on this kind of critique of what is known as a kind of corporal standard, which is a kind of network of process and practice that produces a certain understanding of a specific standardized body. All right, let's go to this question of presence and immersion related to what's called coextensive space. So, according to one of the creators of this project, this doppelganger project, which I quickly showed you a clip of, basically what happens in this work is at first these doppelgangers, of which they increasingly build up from 2 to 4 to 6 to 10 to many more, essentially start to autonomously mirror the user's movements, i.e. mirror control. Now, as the installation is described, in one sense, the virtual doppelgangers influence participants' perception of presence, and we're doing a number of different tests to try to measure this. But the interesting question that the project catalyzes is, what constitutes physically embodied space that is computationally entangled on the one side, and who or what inhabits such a space? So as Michael Saker and Jordan Frith articulate, virtual reality has traditionally little interest in what they call coextensive space. That is, the developing symbiotic relationship between physical and digital that is increasingly proximate, extensive, and transformative. And moreover, using this kind of pass-through techniques, well, users can essentially go beyond this kind of simulation that feigns the materiality of actual space, even though, of course, in virtual reality, these spaces are not very, or even extended reality or mixed reality, these spaces are not concrete per se. Now, what is interesting is that presence here indicates that the user feels that they are physically there, that is present, even though their bodies are usually predominantly immobilized. Of moving in space, but that's pretty much you do, and effectively transported to a dislocated space that is visually and audibly distinct from the space that's actually outside of the headset. Now, what does this emergence of a new technological instrument, let's say, call it the video pass-through augmented HMDs, do from a phenomenological point of view to challenge this long established definitions of immersion and presence that describe HMD-based VR and also AR? So the question is not about whether the sense of presence is better or worse, or higher or lower fidelity due to higher resolution or so on, but rather the question is how might presence be reformulated not only due to a new kind of mediating technology, but also a phenomenology of this technology in use. Now, this notion takes into account the tension between the perceptual experience of being in one's body inside the physically coextensive space, while at the same time having that space mediated by a visual sensing technology. And that is, of course, the camera. Now, in the beginning, with the case of the doppelganger project, one would find it challenging to argue that the space one is seeing with the camera, even though its live feed might be visually distorted, have frame dropouts, a lower pixel resolution, and the like. This is a recent kind of some comments that recent article from Jeremy Valison and others have described in terms of pass-through technology, in terms of the technical affordances of those devices. But of course, it would be hard to claim that the space that one sees with the camera is not the space that one is actually physically moving in. And this is, of course, because of a host of sensory motor contingencies. The different senses give us different channels of feedback about where our bodies are in space and in time. So in other words, what pass-through might then do is to create a kind of productive, but also not entirely resolvable tension between these two kinds of spaces, this coextensive space and then the non-coextensive space. And the coextensive space being a physical space and the non-coextensive space being essentially the kind of digital artifacts that are perhaps embedded in that space. Now, as I stated earlier, one of the key ways that immersion and presence, which of course, as we know, are not the same thing, has been defined in the virtual reality literature, derives from the idea of the suspension of disbelief. And now I'm going to go into the third part, which is to talk a little bit about the kind of critiques of presence that come actually, and I know there's other talks in the conference as well around this, from long critiques coming from theater and performance studies about the stage. And one of the notion of the suspension of disbelief actually comes from the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, but it's been used in theater and performance study for a long time to describe what Marvin Carlson said, where we will ourselves to see as without the necessity of belief. This is, of course, this willing suspension of disbelief that undergirds a lot of understanding of the stage. In other words, we suspend the belief that what we are watching is not real and take on the stance that we will believe that the artificial is real in order to guarantee things like engagement, that we're engaged by this thing, even though we know it's not really happening. Now, clearly, presence theories in virtual reality are built on this cornerstone, right? That the interactor wearing the HMD believes that the body spatially inhabits a real space, right? It's self-located there because the wearer of the HMD always has this first-person point of view, even though the person knows that what they are seeing and sometimes hearing or even feeling is artificially constructed. Now, this is the interesting tension that appears. The process of suspension of disbelief, of believing that you are in one space while your body is in another, is obviously not, as I just said earlier, not unique to VR. It's emblematic of classic dramatic theater where characters are represented on the stage, but at the same time are absent, right? So, of course, you say Hamlet, the actor playing Hamlet on stage is clearly not Hamlet. Hamlet is not there, but at the same time, you have the suspension of the disbelief that Hamlet is actually there, that this character is embodying Hamlet. This is a kind of presence from a distance, and this all seems fine. However, when you start looking at, let's say, go back slide, come back to the long history of the theater in the 20th century and the critiques of what was called pure presence from Jacques Derrida all the way to the phenomenologist Bert States. They have problematized theater theories of presence, i.e., this notion of being there, because these theories assume that the theater is somehow from the start an experience that one believes is real, and that presence is based on this belief. Yet we have to remind ourselves that the theater, like other art forms, is in essence an artifice and a construction. And this is where we kind of say full circle to the question of how the HMD as a technological device mediates these concepts of presence and immersion that we tend to believe in. And indeed, if the suspension of belief model partially connects theater to older ideas of being there in a virtual world, what the virtual world thinking leaves out is another key element of the stage, and that is what's called the technicity of the theater. That is the operative power of a technological system and a process to shape the performance act, and not just as a background support, but as it's constitutive of the theatrical meaning and experience. In other words, that there is not a transcendent stage, that a technical system enables this belief to take place. Now, this we could argue here that the concept of presence and hence immersion might then not be defined by the suspended belief, but by a kind of break, a rupture, a kind of shock that the world that comes to the wearer is anything but real. Now, that real may not, that non-real nature may also be engaging, but this is very important to point out that this concept is not new. If you look at the history of the avant-garde theater and the way that the theater has dealt with machinery, technological machinery on stage since the beginning of the 20th century, if not earlier, you see the attempt to tear down the conception of theater as a realistic experience, as a belief, as a kind of belief, and instead to create works that aim to deconstruct the expectation of real life on the stage at all. So according to the theater theorist Cormac Power, who's talked a lot about this notion of presence, he says that a key feature of theatrical experience involves the simultaneity of imaginally seeing a fictional world that's been conjured up, while also seeing and experiencing the machinery of creating that fictional world. And that means that the kind of idea of, let's say, the illusion of non-mediation actually starts to break down, because you're both aware of the machinery creating the experience at the same time you're aware of kind of seeing the fictional world that machinery is creating. And now let's go back finally in the last 2 minutes to the doppelganger. And what I want to suggest is in this doppelganger experiment, where suddenly you're confronted with a 3D reconstruction of yourself in a real space, but of course is brought to you through the optical array of the headset. I want to suggest that these technologies harnessed to construct this kind of immersion function according to what the Russian formalist literary critic Victor Shklovsky called a device. Okay, so in a 1924 essay entitled "Art is Device," Shklovsky argued that the aim of poetry is to make the reader aware of the devices that make people aware. This concept of what he called, of course, estrangement or estranie is traditionally not discussed in the concept of immersion. It's hard to find. There's some examples, but not a lot. Yet estrangement in Shklovsky and later Bertolt Brecht's concept of Verfremdung or defamiliarization suggests that the performative immersion enabled through technology and emphasized through distance and shock is actually not in opposition, but goes hand in hand. In other words, immersion could be less related to believing something is real and being confronted with the fact that it is artificial. In other words, immersion is not defined necessarily by the technical guarantees of engagement or the suspension of disbelief, or even through media transparency, but rather through this statement that Shklovsky says, where he says, the goal of art is to create a sensation of seeing, not merely recognizing things. The device of art is the estrangement of things and the complication of form, which increases the duration and complexity of perception, as the process of perception is in art an end in itself and must be prolonged. So in other words, the plausibility of the real comes from the fact that perception itself is no longer naturalized, but defamiliarized. Thank you.
You can hear.
You can hear? Yeah?
Yeah, I can hear.
Oh, that's what you were trying to tell me.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Chris. Fascinating. Let's open to some questions. Have we any questions?
I know people are processing this.
I will ask you a question because I found it very interesting. And I've just pick up on this idea of the shock, right? So the one thing I know, or we tend to talk about in our work, is everything that everyone is discussing today or has ever discussed about VR today, and for a long time, is always a discussion of an imperfect VR, right? We're far from being able to create a completely transparent experience of something. So every time you put someone in VR, you're putting them in an alien sensory motor relationship with a world, right? Something, and this is part of the experience. And in fact, I think we lose sight of this. Everything we discuss is about this alien relationship that you're temporarily giving people. So maybe you could say this. So you're saying basically a lot about is about this alien, or in fact, all mediations are about this alien relationship with the world.
Definitely, and that's really important because I so much in the literature, there's this understanding that we're trying to get, whether through fidelity, through technological fidelity, toward this perfect vision, right, of the world. But this, as I said, is a technological. This is a mediating device, and even though we pretend that of course we'll lose sense of it, like we're believing what we see, there is an illusion of non-mediation, these classic theories around presence. We don't forget that. And what I see that's quite interesting. I mean, I was actually coming again from the stage and building big installations, dealing with the senses for many years. I was never very interested in virtual reality. It was only when the ability to play with this mixture between the computational and the so-called physical through pass-through, because of course many of these early devices like HoloLens and Magic Leap were all very bounded by limited field of view and these kinds of things. But by playing with this camera mediation, especially with audience members, not just with kind of trained performers, what you're confronted with is this complete utter strangeness, that somehow this can't be real, because I know that this object that's flying at me at 120 miles an hour is not there. I might respond to it as if it's there. This is, of course, the plausibility illusion, although, of course, there's nothing plausible. For instance, one piece we made called Animate, which was shown actually in Weimar, it's been touring, which is dealing with climate change. There's a scene at the end where we move into mixed reality, and there's 800 rocks that explode through this space, and we've photogrammetry the real spaces we're in. So basically, these rocks hit the surfaces of things, and so of course people respond to them as if they're real. But there's no flying rocks in like our reality in that sense, So there's this. If we start to kind of suspend this belief in we're getting closer and closer, the kind of proximate future toward this perfect sense, and if we just say this is not going to be perfect, and that's the interesting aesthetic properties of these systems, then we maybe we can resolve some of these endless tensions that we have toward believing that this environment is closer and closer to some notion of real, when in fact you're already, especially in pass-through, you're already in the real in that sense. You're in the physical space. And that, I think, is forgotten in the sense of trying to somehow be transcendent beyond that embodied effect.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. There's one question from the room.
Sure.
I think maybe kind of like two questions and one comment and a question. So, with respect to this idea of shock, I'm thinking of the concept of the senses and how that would. This seems to be like how you, and then also brings it into the political with the Rancière.
Yes, and then, totally.
the question I had relates to the second, I think the second part of your project, but by the way, sounds amazing. I'm wondering about what disability studies kind of tells us about this, of what you said now. Like how, I'm curious if what work you do in that
Yeah.
part of the.
Yeah, thanks for that question and comment. So on the disability study side, this is quite complex because I have one PhD working on trying to make this connection between HCI and disability studies, which is completely in tension with one another. On the one side, HCI kind of praises notions of universal design. On the other side of disability studies, there is no universal design. There's only uniqueness of unique bodies. And for instance, in a project that Puneet Jain, this PhD of mine, has been doing, he's been working with quadriplegic artists, one in Montreal and the other who's a German computer scientist who's is not only quadriplegic, but has also strong sensory motor disabilities and can barely move any limb except his mouth. And so what Puneet has done is basically he's been developing mouth interfaces. This is the only part of the body that these two artists he's been working with have that have any kind of mobility. And it's very interesting because he kind of hacked an early VR chat webcam to try to analyze using some basic features like different movements of the tongue and different movements of the mouth. Of course, again, between these two artists he's working with, and it's a very small sample size because each of them have very different characteristics of the mouth. For instance, Christian Beilen, who he's working with in Germany, has malocclusion of the teeth, so the vision algorithm is completely thrown off by that, even though the mouth is still very present as a device. So very much what I think you start to see is that it's extremely difficult to have this kind of one fits all standard for these technologies, and no one really thinks about this, but in the belief of trying to naturalize interaction, you forget things. So, for instance, with the Apple Vision Pro, the idea of naturalizing gesture, and well, if you don't have hands, if you cannot move, you cannot even navigate in this device. First of all, you can't put it on your head if you can't move your hands. Second of all, the belief to kind of remove all this kind of, the kind of notions of mice and standard interface devices doesn't work because you're not privileged. Your body is not some kind of ideal, as I said, standard that can navigate in these devices. So I think we have to be very, very careful when we talk about kind of naturalizing interfaces and making them intuitive. We have to ask whose bodies are we making those devices intuitive for?
All right. Thank you very much, Chris. We have reached our time. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And now I will invite Robin Zawalski to come and join us here in presence.
So can we still make if possible?
Oh, can everyone contact you by email, Christopher?
Sure, please.
Yeah.
Here's my email address.
Thank you.
Thank you. And one more round of applause for Christopher.